Hey gang, bit of a switch up this week. I'm replying to an audio podcast, which means there's no video to respond to. In other words, the only person you'll be looking at will be me. Would you knock it off? Fine, but they're still going to be able to hear me. Let's just get on with this.
One of the scariest potential conversations or potential interactions is with someone who says, I don't believe in God at all. I'm an atheist. I feel like we all kind of have that moment of like, oh, okay, I don't know what to do with that.
Right.
So the question today is just how do you respond to somebody who is an atheist, who says, I don't believe in God at all? How do you engage with a person like that?
No, great question.
Easy. As you're a theist, just say, I believe this, you don't. End of conversation. Wow, that was pretty easy. All right, let's keep listening.
I actually was on a flight last week, and I sat next to a guy who identified himself very quickly as an atheist. There's a set of questions that I like to ask an atheist.
Okay, I don't want to call you a liar, but it's become such a cliche these days for a theist to be an atheist or a philosophy professor on a plane and get into a theological debate. I'm not saying that it never happens, but I've been on more than my share of flights and have never blurted out, hey, I'm an atheist, debate me. I mean, it's up there with claiming to have a girlfriend in Canada. It's possible to have one, but sounds somewhat suspicious whenever it's claimed.
You could have been the girlfriend in Canada I told everyone I had.
Sometimes you just want to help them see the internal inconsistencies, and atheism is a very internally inconsistent faith.
Gotta clear this up. Atheism in general isn't a faith. It is simply not accepting the claims that an intelligent creator being fashioned the universe. If I was to make a positive claim that there is definitely no God, that would be faith, but not accepting a claim is not faith.
It's one of the things that you find is that for all the intellectual rigor that goes in it, there's some really basic, things that are really helpful to explore. For a question, for example, I always ask the question, the obvious one, okay, what about ultimate origins? And I always quote Dawkins here because Dawkins, Richard Dawkins, who wrote, the God Delusion, he says, hey, Darwin's theory works for biology. Darwin's theory, he believes, explains everything after the Big Bang, but it doesn't work for cosmology or ultimate origins.
No. Darwin's theory of biological diversity through natural selection only begins after self-replicating molecules are formed. It says absolutely nothing about the expansion of the universe, the cooling of energy and the forming of matter, about how stars and planets form, or many other scientific theories. It in no way attempts to explain everything after the Big Bang. Darwin's theory was simply that as mutations occur in biological organisms, the ones best able to survive and breed are more likely to survive and breed, passing on those beneficial mutations. And this has been substantiated and supported since he published his work.
He admits it's a problem. He says ultimately cosmology is waiting on its Darwin because he knows it's self-evident that nothing times nobody can't equal everything.
Yeah.
And eventually you can't push it back far enough and just say, well, matter must be eternal because how can something inherently in and of itself be eternal? It's just it's a big problem.
It's not a problem. It's something that we don't know yet. Just because we don't have an answer to a question doesn't mean that we have to accept any explanation put forth, especially one that doesn't have any evidence to back it up.
He says, we've got to have a theory that explains why there is something rather than nothing. He says, but, don't worry because ultimately we'll figure it out, which is ironically a pretty big faith leap.
I admit I could be wrong, but I couldn't find anywhere where Dawkins makes the claim that we will definitely figure out the cause of the universe. He has hope that we'll find one, but he's not making any leap of faith that we will definitely discover some underlying principle for the formation of the universe. However, we don't need a competing theory to dismiss an unsubstantiated claim. As I just said, saying, I don't know, is preferable if we, don't know something. Nobody says we have to have a theory to explain the universe, or else we know that it was sneezed out by the Great Green Arkle seizure. Of course that claim is dismissed, since there's no evidence behind it. And as for your deity as the explanation of the universe, there's no evidence behind it either. And we shouldn't be simply saying God automatically fills in the blanks for what we don't know.
Yeah,
Right.
which is interesting because I feel like most atheists would kind of say, like, the whole point of it is, you have faith in all this stuff that you don't understand. I'm just dealing with what I can see.
Right.
But really, right off the bat, there's this moment of, well, no, you're actually taking the same leap of faith that I'm taking at some level, maybe even a bigger one.
How is admitting ignorance taking a leap of faith? There are many things about the universe we still don't know. If we said we definitely know something without evidence, that would be a leap of faith.
Right, because you get to the ultimate question.
Yeah.
Why is there something rather than nothing? Because nothing times nobody can equal everything. And they say, well, we don't know, but I'm sure there's an answer out there somewhere.
Yeah.
If everything has to be created, then what about your deity? It gets special pleading because it's a god and therefore timeless and outside the universe? If you're allowed to claim that your explanation is not dependent on having a source, then can't an unintelligent cause of the universe be accepted just as easily? I keep repeating myself, but I don't know what the cause of the universe is. We may never know for sure, so simply saying, I don't know, is more intellectually honest than attributing it to a deity that we have no reason to accept.
All right, so what about origins? Here's one that's related to that is what about all the, not just apparent design, but what some scientists say might be the greatest indication that there's a creator behind all this. And it's just this, they call it the Goldilocks principle.
Yeah.
Remember your favorite book when you were a kid, Goldilocks?
Yes.
And I think it's still your favorite book now,
Yeah,
isn't it?
read it this morning.
Just to be sure, you do know the Goldilocks story is fictional, right? The talking animals were kind of a giveaway. I mean, not all fiction contains talking animals, but anthropomorphizing animals with human speech is a good way to tell stories made up and fictional in nature. Oh, nuts.
But remember the soup was just right, not too hot, not too cold.
Yep.
The more technical term is the anthropomorphic principle, and it's basically that our world seems ideally designed to sustain life.
Yeah.
This is not the place to go into all the science, but it's things like the ratio of the gases in the atmosphere, nitrogen, CO2. I mean, if CO2, they say, were up by even 0.5% more, life could not be sustained on Earth. The tilt of the Earth, 23.5 degrees, if it were just another degree or two, you couldn't sustain life on Earth. Even little odd things like the fact that the water molecule, when it freezes, it's the only molecule that when it freezes actually becomes lighter than it is when it's a liquid, which means that ice doesn't go sink to the bottom of the ocean. It floats. And if it sunk to the bottom of the ocean, you would freeze the oceans from the bottom up and we would all die.
Okay, let's break these down. Where you claim that all these are needed to be so fine-tuned as to be necessary for life? CO2 levels have been constantly changing over Earth's history, and life has adapted to those changes. Life can theoretically exist on planets with different degrees, but since the seasons would be different, life would probably evolve differently than what we have on Earth. Scientists even say that unconventional tilts could be a boon for some planets to support life. And finally, water does not get any lighter when it changes from a solid to a liquid. What happens is that it expands when it solidifies due to the rigid crystalline structure it takes on. Since it now takes up more space but has not gained any additional mass, it's less dense than when it was a liquid, which means as a solid, it'll be more buoyant than liquid water. And water is definitely not the only substance that expands when it solidifies. Acetic acid, for example. In fact, and this is useless trivia, knowing when molecules expand when solidifying is useful for making movable type out of things like bismuth. The fact that it expands when solidifying makes blocks of type that can produce sharper images. You're looking at things backwards. Yes, we fit into the environment that we find ourselves in because that's what we evolved in response to. But if things were different, life would be different. If you change the environment that life is evolving in, it will evolve to suit that environment. It doesn't mean that life was set up just for us. It means that life evolved to fit into the environment it found itself in. As the planet changes, the organisms on the planet change too.
So there's all these things that are like this is, I can't remember the exact statistic, but the odds of it just kind of happening are just so astronomical, no pun intended, that you're like something obviously tweaked it so that it can sustain life on Earth.
Yes, if you chose one random planet out of the universe and found that it was compatible for life, that would be an astronomically unlikely find. But the universe contains a huge number of planets, at least a few dozen. Right. From our observations, our galaxy itself contains 100 billion stars. There are roughly 10 billion galaxies in the universe. Even with all the variables needed for life, out of all the planets in the vast universe, the fact that at least one had the right conditions for life to form is not at all surprising. And since this was a planet on which life was able to and did develop, we can look back and not be surprised that it had the right conditions for life to develop.
And the third question is, what about the problem of evil? That's always one that atheists tend to direct toward Christians. Like, well, if there's a good God, then how could, bad things be happening? But it actually is a more intellectual problem for them because according to an atheistic worldview, there really is no such thing as evil. And this is not smoke and mirrors. It's a legitimate point. It's like if all there is are materials and there's no divine lawgiver, then all we have are things that are useful for the propagation of the species, not things that are evil in and of themselves.
That's because evil is a concept, not a thing. You cannot show me a handful of evil. Evil is what we define it to be. Personally, I say that evil is anything that causes a great amount of harm without any kind of corresponding good.
There's something in us that knows that, no, that's not only not useful, that's evil. Somebody that targets one type of person, whether it's a race or whether a certain demographic, and just says they're worthless and we should be able to trample over them. You say, well, that's not just unhelpful for the species. That's evil inherently.
And you've just disproven your own point. because what we consider evil changes from person to person and from time to time. If evil was some kind of natural law, like gravity, or imprinted on us by some divine being, it wouldn't change. What one person considers evil would be the exact same thing as what everybody else considers evil. But we know that attitudes towards what is right and wrong have changed and varied over human history. We're currently living in a time where the majority of the planet actually thinks that owning other human beings is a bad thing. But for most of human history, owning people was considered a good and acceptable practice. At the time, much of society, at least those that weren't slaves, didn't think it was evil, but we can look back and say yes, it was an evil practice, because now we see that human beings are the same and deserve rights regardless of ethnic or social background. If you were asked today by the father of the woman you were enamored with to kill and mutilate 100 people for you, just so you could marry their daughter, even if it was a trap, and you not only went ahead with it, but killed and mutilated twice that many, that would be seen as a somewhat, let's say, evil act. But for the writers of this story, it was seen as a good thing. What we consider acceptable changes over time. I always like to wonder what practices and beliefs we have right now that we think are acceptable that future generations will look back upon and think how cruel and backwards we were.
So when you say there's no such thing as evil, you kind of neuter the ability to call for justice.
No, because justice is not about good or evil. It's about, at least in theory, making sure that everybody has the same rights and should be held accountable if they harm others. Shoplifting a chocolate bar is not an evil act, but in a just society, there should be proportional consequences. I think people should be treated the same, not because some deity says so, but because I have empathy for other humans. And since I want to be treated fairly and not harmed by others, I think others should be treated fairly and not harmed either.
It's interesting. This guy on the plane actually admitted, he said, yeah, I admit that every justice movement that we've seen over the last, 2,000-3,000 years has come because somebody was appealing to the way God designed it to be, and the way that it is not the way that he wants it to be.
Yeah.
So I think it's an important one.
But remember that those fighting against such societal change were also often invoking their religious beliefs to maintain how things were at the time. If the only reason that change occurs is because of the religious beliefs of its adherents, then every member of that religion would see the need for justice immediately, and such changes would not need to have taken place because the injustices would never have happened in the first place. And remember, the current fight for equality, getting equal rights for the LGBT community, has not exactly been spearheaded by most churches.
One more I'll give on this one before I think the ultimate saving Jasmine is what about the sense of personhood that we have? If all we are in there are chemicals bouncing around, then consciousness is an illusion. Love that I feel for my wife is not really love. It's basically a way my brain is tricking me to have a relationship that will ultimately further my DNA so that it can
Yes, that's how it is. My thoughts and actions are controlled by the chemical and electrical changes in the brain. You may not like it, but there's been no evidence there's anything beyond the physical changes in the brain that makes up our personality. As far as we can tell, who I am is entirely based on the physical makeup of my brain. As I learn and experience new things, my brain changes to encompass the new experiences I have. As it changes, my personality changes as well. I grow into a new and, I hope, better human being. And while you may not like this, you may think it takes something special away from who we are if it all boils down to chemistry and physical properties. I find it amazing and fascinating that billions of years of guess-and-check evolution have brought about such an amazing and complicated organ in humans.
And by the way, that's not a good line to use on Valentine's Day.
No.
Like, hey, the chemicals in my brain have somehow attached significance to you to propagate my DNA into the next generation. It's just, it doesn't have that romantic ring. So
That doesn't make a good card.
Let me try that out. Hey baby, when I think of you, my brain floods with dopamine and oxytocin, creating a feeling of euphoria and a desire for emotional and physical bonding.
Aw, sweetie. Hey, when you're done recording, would you like to engage in coital pairing? That, while evolved to invoke pleasure, which encourages breeding viable offspring, also has the side effect of being a pleasant activity between two or more people to become an enjoyable recreational activity?
I love being married to a biologist.
So those are more the philosophical bent. The big one that I try to get to is, what about Jesus?
Yeah.
So what about origins? What about design? What about evil? What about personality? And the last one, what about Jesus? And so just, I point them to, hey, who was this man that walked in history? What was the truth behind the resurrection? Like, how can you deny that something significant, something of God happened?
Because there's no evidence for him. The Gospels were written years, if not decades, after the events they claim happened, and are full of inconsistencies and errors like, where was Jesus born? And examples of censuses that never took place or over the area that the time period claimed. The only contemporary writings of Jesus are from Paul, and he claimed he got his information from Revelation, not actually witnessing anything. Was there a guy who got nailed to a piece of wood for saying how great it would be if people got along? Possibly. Did he have magic powers and come back to life days later? The lack of evidence makes me think this is unlikely. The Bible has lots of stories about this Jesus guy, but that's all they are. Stories. It makes plenty of claims about him, but none that can be corroborated. And yes, the Bible does mention historical figures and places that we do have independent evidence for, but Spider-Man comics occasionally feature real people and occur in New York, which, and this may surprise some of you, is an actual place. That doesn't point to those stories being true either.
Hey, can I give you one word of encouragement,
Yeah.
too, based on what you said at the beginning? It is intimidating to talk to an atheist, but according to Romans 1, they already deep down inherently know the truth.
Yeah.
I don't mean that they're lying to you. They may really convince themselves there's no God, but inherently they've always known it to be true, and they're suppressing that truth. That helps me when I'm talking to somebody like that, because ultimately I kind of know, like, hey,
Yeah.
you know,
I'm right. Yeah.
There's something in you. I'm reminding you of what you've always known to be true.
Again, this is another claim that has no evidence to back it up. You in your book can claim that I actually believe you, but what do you have to prove that I do? I could write out that theists don't really believe a God exists, they just pretend to feel morally superior or to keep being afraid of death. But just because it's claimed and written down doesn't mean it's true. I'm sure that both of you really do believe, and saying that you actually don't would be just as insulting to you as your claims that I actually believe without knowing my thoughts would be to me.
Oh, I wish you could meet my girlfriend who lives in Canada. She couldn't be sweeter. I wish you could meet her, my girlfriend who lives in Canada.
Oh, I want to add a little something. As always, I had my science advisor go through my script as I was writing it up. I want to share the notes they left. But, according to Romans 1, they already deep down inherently know the truth. Ahaha, ha ha ha, ROFLMAO. Now that's some science right there.